Hi friends, it's Brittany at Ink and Papyrus and welcome back to my channel. I'm so glad you're with me today because we are making one of my absolute favorite embellishments, and that is paper buttons. But don't go anywhere. I know you've probably made paper buttons, but I bet you've never made paper buttons like these before. Let's get started. If you're anything like me, you probably love using paper buttons to embellish your journal. I love the look of a button, but buttons have a lot of bulk and they bulk up your journal way too fast. Hence why I like to make paper buttons. In the past, though, I've usually just made paper buttons out of cardstock. Cardstock is the perfect thickness after all, and normally the page already has a pattern on it and is already decorated. But let's take these to the next level. You can see I've amassed quite the collection of paper buttons here. I have used washi tape, jelly prints, wrapping paper, cardstock of course, book pages, watercolor paper buttons, even using nail polish. There are a couple of nuances to each of these techniques, but in general, this is a really easy project, and we're using materials that I guarantee you have at home. The one thing maybe not everybody has is a crocodile or an eyelet setter. And eyelets, those are really easy to get, and I will include a link below in the description box if you want to check it out. But even then, you don't have to. You can simply poke some holes with either an owl or a sewing needle or just a really small paper puncher. So really, I guarantee you have all of the tools you need at home to make some paper buttons. These buttons were made from magazine images glued onto book pages with some text over top. Just as a reminder, your buttons don't have to be traditional. They can be of different shapes and sizes. These jumbo square buttons may not look like your traditional button, but I love using these in larger journal layouts or as closures on envelopes or on the journal cover themselves. If you're worried your non-traditional buttons don't look like buttons, try threading some cording or embroidery floss or threads through the holes you punched, and I guarantee you they will already start to look more like a button. So you don't think you have the images, the magazine images to make buttons. I assure you, you do. Sometimes when we crop an image down, it just takes on a life of its own. On on a page, some of these images kind of just look like junk. One of them is from a recipe that I would probably never use. Another one is a dog as a part of an advertisement. And another one is from this Home and Gardens magazine. It looks like a bed set. I would never normally use that image, but that dog is adorable. That recipe, when we when we cut it down to the focal point being the raspberries, they just look scrumptious and pretty darn adorable. And that bed set, that wallpaper, that is really pretty patterned images, and the pattern makes a perfect button. So my advice to you, pick a focal point, crop it down, and I guarantee you, you can make a button, even if you're just using the pattern as a background and adding some decorations on top, which we can talk about in a little bit. I guarantee you it will make a great button. Now, obviously, magazine images are not going to produce enough thickness to make a button, and that's where these book pages come in. Regardless of the paper source that I use, in many of my buttons, I use book pages. Why? I just have an abundance of books lying around. It's a great way to use up book pages, and they have the perfect thickness that just a couple of them stacked together seem to create the perfect thickness for a paper button. Simply start by gluing the images to the magazine paper with a regular glue stick. Now, a smart person would probably say you should wait for this glue to dry before you punch out your buttons, but it seems to work just fine. I don't find that my punches get gummed up or anything like that, and oftentimes I'll put more than one image on a book page just to, save some book pages. I like to kind of take up all the space and then start punching things out. Now you do want to cut the dead space off of your images, and you want to cut away any remaining book page because obviously there's only so far that your punch can reach. If you leave a bunch of dead space or book page on the sides, you're probably going to get a punch that has a lot of, white space and book page and not the magazine image as the focal point. I hope that makes sense. Don't forget, pages can actually be more difficult to punch out if they're thin. You'll never be able to cleanly punch out magazine pages. This is why I always glue them to the book pages first, and oftentimes when I'm punching out the book pages, I will add either cardstock or a stack of a few book pages behind it. That way it gives it some thickness, you get a nice clean punch, and in a couple of punches you'll have all the pages you'll need to stack in order to give your button some thickness. Next up, washi tape paper buttons. I love these. I love the way they look. They're so easy to make. You can come up with some beautiful pattern buttons with just a couple of steps and a couple of minutes. And let's face it, like many of you, I love a project that forces me to use those hordes of washi tape that I bought that are lying in the same place that they were when I received them in the mail. Yes, I am very guilty of hoarding washi tape. So let's get to it. The way I'm doing this, I find, is the fastest, most efficient way to make these washi paper buttons. Yes, you could individually cut out each button and washi over it, but that's a lot of minutia and extra steps and very tedious. I recommend laying it down on a book page like this. Yes, you may have some little odds and ends that you don't use, but just like me, I bet you have plenty of washi tape to spare lying around, and of course you could save your scraps for another project if you would like. I recommend taking a mat or a cutting board and just leaving a little bit of washi tape hang over at each of the ends when you're laying it down so that your book page doesn't move. Go ahead and put some glue stick all over the page. The washi tape just tends to stick and actually continue to stick better this way. After you lay down washi in an alternating pattern, or if you want, you can just use the same one for the entire page. You can go ahead, flip the page over, and you're going to take that remaining piece of washi tape that's hanging over the book page, put a little bit of glue down, and then fold it over, and then continue your washi, ideally the same type of washi, the same pattern on the back of the page. You are going to repeat this process until the washi tape has covered the front and the back page, ideally lined up as neatly as you can muster. Go ahead and trim off any excess washi you have, and we will be ready to start punching out our buttons. This last can be a little bit tricky. I tend not to back the washi paper or stick anything else under it because I think that just the book page with the washi tape over it does tend to provide enough thickness that if you put any other pages with it, I think your punch will struggle. I also find that sometimes, no matter how well I lay the washi down, sometimes it can crinkle up, and sometimes you will have a little bit of issues with the punch depending on how good of a punch it is. Usually, though, you can muster on by, get it to punch through. You may have to trim off a little bit of the excess after the punch is complete. Sometimes your washi tape punch outs will reveal a nice, clean, crisp edge, sometimes not, but I find there's always some kind of indentation there where you can easily follow the line and cut off the excess, or alternatively, you could use just a sanding block and sand it down. Don't let, I mean, it can be a minor inconvenience, but don't let this sway you away. These washi tape buttons are fabulous. And remember, buttons come in all shapes and sizes, just like those magazine buttons you saw me make that were jumbo and square in size. These postage stamp buttons are adorable as well. That remaining last layer of washi tape with the monuments, I decided to make my own collection of postage stamp travel theme buttons. I had these really small eyelets and it was perfect. They didn't eat up too much of the button, and I made myself a whole collection of these, and they're just darling. I think they're one of my absolute favorite buttons that I made in this tutorial. As for the monument-themed washi tape, it's obviously very translucent and you could see the text of the book coming through. I thought this only made these this much more magical. A couple of the book pages just had some numbers up at the top where I punched around them, and so you just see the monument and a couple of random numbers, and I love the effect. It was perfect. The postage stamp punch and the small circular punch was doing a killer job at getting these washi tape buttons out with a really clean, crisp edge. So I used them to create a lot of buttons. The small circular punch created some really small buttons that is probably too small for an eyelet. Actually, you could probably fit one mini eyelet, but it would be very tedious. And when you use these really small buttons and you punch really small holes through them, they look fabulous. They look exactly like buttons, and you don't really need to do anything more to them. Once you've punched out a couple buttons, often you'll have to cut along the circular edges to make a straight edge to continue to punch buttons. It's really as simple as that. Punch, rinse, and repeat. You can see how easy these come together, especially since you have washi on the front and the back side. You don't need to layer anything. They already are the perfect thickness. It's just the initial hassle of laying down the washi. Which brings me to my next point. Not all buttons have to have a front and a back. It depends on what you're using them for. If you're using them as a closure, um, sturdy to the journal cover, you obviously don't need to create a back. The back's not going to be showing. If you're going to be gluing them down on a page in a layout, for example, you don't need to create a back. The back will not be showing. If you're not sure what the purpose of your button is going to be, I recommend making some with a front and a back. It's all up to you. Like the nail polish buttons, for example, I was very impatient. I didn't want to wait for them to dry, so I made them single-sided buttons. There are plenty of ways to utilize both. Don't be afraid to experiment with it. Here I layered some different washi that sort of had an antique slash vintage feel. I made some really pretty unicorn washi buttons with some glitter washi tape that I don't really use all that much. Usually it doesn't fit with the projects I'm working on, but it fit perfectly. And of course, I had a random unicorn roll of washi tape in my washi tape stash. I have no idea where that came from. Nevertheless, it was there. So get funky with it. It doesn't have to have any rhyme or reason necessarily. Get some contrasting colors. Make it bright and bold. The eyelets themselves can be a different method of decoration. You don't have to get just the same old boring white or silver or gold eyelets. Believe it or not, and I know this because I just recently ran out of eyelets, they have eyelets that have flower shapes, heart shapes. They have eyelets that it just will blow your mind. I had no idea these things even existed. So that you can doll up the actual buttons themselves by inking around the edges, adding some stickles, adding some die cuts on top, which we will do in a couple of minutes from now. So, this can be a base. This can be just the start of your button. If you want, you can take it as far as you want to go. Think of other ways that you can make your buttons look like they have buttonholes without punching holes or setting eyelets. You could layer something with texture, i.e., um, layer some stickles into just put a couple of dots where the buttonholes would be. Alternatively, you could punch through some brads, and instead of there being holes there, you'd have brads there. Just a couple of different ideas. I want to point out another tip. I don't know why it's taken me so long to figure this out, but that blue slider is perfect for kind of finding the half point. If you line your button up with the blue slider, you can punch a hole in the top and the bottom and make sure they line up in a straight line. You can do the same thing by turning your button to the side if you're making holes horizontally, but I can't tell you how many buttons I made where I look at it after I've set the eyelet and I'm like, oh, those buttonholes are cockeyed. Why haven't I been using this all along? I don't know why. Obvious things like that sometimes are completely lost on me, but nevertheless, if you're like me and you never notice why that little thing was there, That is why it is there. And I am no eyelet setting expert, but one of the things that really has helped me was, first of all, just playing around with it, making sure the nipple of the eyelet lines up and seats perfectly on that bottom part before you press the down button. And then in order to do that, instead of looking at it from up top, look at it from the side. That's why I'm sorry my head's in the way of the film several times, but that's because I kind of had to duck my head down to like make sure it was aligned. You're never going to figure it out if you're looking over the top of your eyelet setter. Look at it from the side and get much nicer of a view. You can see exactly what you are doing. Double check before you set the eyelet, and you should be good to go. You don't always have to punch your holes and set the eyelets in the same configuration, and in fact, when you have patterns or pictures on your washi tape you want to leave intact, you may opt for a more abnormal configuration, whether that be a horizontal line or even a single larger eyelet, something off to the side. It all works. Just think about one, what you may be using the button for, two, if there's anything on the button that you want to avoid or leave intact, and three, if you're going to be threading cording or embroidery floss through the buttons, you may be covering up words and pictures that way, in which case you may decide to, again, punch your buttons in a little bit of a different configuration. As you probably noticed, some of the buttons, after I punched them, I struggled to get the little bits through the holes. You know, there would be like some leftover book page or washi. Just try not to, like maybe twist it around. It'll come off. Try not to peel it because you will rip the button. Sometimes the easiest thing to do is just push the eyelet through, set the eyelet, and it kind of just works itself out. Um, that's, one of the other downsides to the washi tape buttons, but you can pretty much work around it. I think of like 100 washi tape buttons I made, I think I only ruined one. Okay, guys, get ready. We are about to blast through some ideas. The last several minutes, I wanted to sort of focus on the nuances of making the buttons, punching holes, setting eyelets, and some other considerations. The rest of this video is just going to be a nice deep dive into all of the different paper buttons that you can make. I'm going to come at you rapid fire, so let's go. Textured buttons. Who doesn't love a good textured button? Today we are doing that with modeling paste and some stencils. It just adds a little layer of complexity, and again, it gives it some texture. The only thing you should know about this one is we are going to be adding the texture before we add the eyelets, if you choose to add eyelets, because the modeling paste will completely muck it up and you won't be able to lay your stencil flat. You can thank me later. These are the things that you might not think of until you're in the thick of it, but trust me on this one. Make sure you have your stenciling done with your modeling paste, and make sure the buttons are dry before you try and set your eyelets. You can obviously use any paper you want. I just think the brown looks so good contrasted with the white modeling paste here. I am going to be layering up some book pages to give that brown paper the extra added thickness that it needs, punching my holes and stenciling away. Make sure that if you want a front and a back, you layer the back side of the book pages with brown paper packaging as well. I actually really like the look of the brown paper packaging, and the texture paste on one side and the book page on the other side. So technically, I guess it does have a front and a back. I am not nearly patient enough to wait for modeling paste to dry on two sides, so that's why I chose to make these the way that I did. Wait, so I hope I didn't mislead you. Definitely set your eyelets later. Punch your holes first, okay? Because if you don't punch your holes, you're going to be trying to punch through the modeling paste, which is not going to be any fun. So punch your holes first, then stencil the modeling paste. Once the modeling paste is completely dry, you can set your eyelets. If you're worried about a little spillover of modeling paste in your holes, don't worry. Any kind of hole punch is going to take care of it fine. It's really soft. Or you could just put a sewing needle through and like kind of clean them out before the modeling paste dries. And don't be afraid if your stencil overlies the holes. It's okay. Like the modeling paste is no sweat to just like push out with the sewing needle or the actual crocodile itself. I didn't even really clean the holes out and just put the eyelets straight in. I don't know, you might gum up your machine that way, but it's so flaky once it dries. It's really no sweat if you get some. Don't change the way you're stenciling, or gosh forbid, try and drag your stencil over and muck up the modeling paste that you've already put down. Remember, the more layers, the thicker the layer, the thicker the more bulk the button is going to have. And the best way to create a nice crisp image is to hold your stencil down and make sure it doesn't move as you apply the modeling paste. You can apply it with anything you want. I just think applying it with a putty knife is the easiest, and it just helps you get a nice even layer. If you accidentally move your stencil in the process, you can clean it up with something like I have here. I think it's an old kebab, or you can clean it up with a toothpick or a pencil. Up to you. Don't worry about the little smudges. I actually decided to take these a little bit further, and even though I really do like the look of the white modeling paste against the brown paper packaging, I decided to, once it was dry, go over it with watercolors, and I do love the way these turned out. The music note button I colored with gold gilding wax. The rest of them I colored with watercolors, and I wasn't sure if there was going to be enough contrast, so I tried to stick to bright bold colors, but over the modeling paste it worked perfectly. The watercolor paint seemed to glide over the modeling paste just fine. If you are wondering whether watercolor paints really paint over modeling paste well, this is your answer. Definitely try it. You'll love this. While I had my watercolors out, I decided to grab some plain cardstock and just create some wet on wet loose watercolor painting, which inevitably turned into some just very loose flowers. I didn't attempt and paint individual flowers. I just put what I thought maybe to look like stems on to the flowers and punched them out. I made them have a front and a back, and the cardstock was thick enough that I just glued the two of them together, punched some holes, set some eyelets, and I think they're beautiful. I set aside my watercolor painting to dry, and remember I had some stamped watercolor embellishments that I had made. I did punch out one of these hearts with the circle punch, but I thought, it would be really cool to make some different shaped buttons. So I fussy cut out the hearts that had already been watercolor painted inside, and I lined them up so they're basically a mirror image of each other. Of course, you can do this with any shape. It just needs to be a simple shape, so again, that you can make a mirror image of it so that you have, again, a front and a back. Line it up, cut off any excess, make sure they're nice and even, and create a button. Then punch your holes, set your eyelets just like you normally would. I just love the watercolor painting inside the hearts, and I just think it's so cool to have buttons of non-traditional shapes, just like you would, those cute little vintage buttons you find that are dragonflies and hearts and flowers. Like, I kind of wanted to replicate that. Next, I dug into my scrap drawer. I have a ton of blank white paper, and so I was like, let's do something from scratch. So I just started punching out a bunch of circles and layering them together. I end up doing some form of stamped paper buttons, and then I set some extra ones aside because I want to play around with some nail polish later. I was initially worried these were going to be too plain and boring, but I actually love the simplicity of this. I think the small images with a word or a number is perfect. You can obviously set some decorative eyelets, ink them around when they're done to jazz them up a little bit. I did find that, especially if you're stamping a small image a few times, just stamping off the button itself just gives it more depth. I don't know, it just seems more interesting. But yeah, just a few images and a word or a number is perfect. And then it's really as easy as that. And I think that makes for a gorgeous button. Obviously, you don't have to do this on white paper. I just had a lot of white scraps lying around. You could do this like book pages that don't have a whole lot of text on this may look really nice. Plain cardstock, even that brown packaging that I was using earlier, if you use a darker color stamp, I think that would look magnificent. The textured buttons are back, guys. The modeling paste is dry, as is the watercolor, and the eyelets are set. I just had to show you the finished product. I was initially a little worried the watercolor paint would fade over the modeling paste as it dried, but it's still pretty brilliant. And the eyelets make these look so complete, so I had to show you. I'm sorry the video jumps around a little bit. It was kind of just a matter of waiting till things were done drying, so bear with me, but here they are. Here's another idea for you guys, sewn paper buttons. And I was thinking about this when I did the last modeling paste buttons. I was like, how else could we add texture to buttons? Well, you can sew them. The threads themselves add texture. Now, you see me here, I'm distressing the white paper just because I have white thread, so it would be kind of boring, white paper, white thread. But when you distress it and you color the button, obviously the white thread shows up really well. All I'm doing is just stressing a front and a back. I punch out multiple layers so the button has some thickness, but there's no need to glue because I'm putting it right through the sewing machine. And all I'm doing is holding be careful, but I'm just holding the paper down, the papers down together, and kind of making a wheel and just going around with the threads until I run out of room, and then I set an eyelet. I tried to leave myself a little bit of room in the middle to punch a hole, and there you have it. You have a sewn paper button. I'm sure there's more elegant or fancy way to do this, but again, it was just kind of meant to be whimsical and add some texture, and I love these. Okay, now it's time to get really funky and experiment around. We are trying to make paper buttons that we've never made before, right? So, what do you have a stash of that you could really it's due to be used? Well, for me and in my room, it is nail polish. I have accumulated way too many of these over the years, and the consistency isn't right anymore, and they should probably be thrown out. But I've been saving them for a project like this, and I know that regardless of the color I choose, it will look perfect on this plain white paper I have. It also will give us a little texture and dimensions when we add droplets, and I have a couple of tools next to me that we can use to swirl and create different patterns. Again, don't take it too seriously. Let's just have some fun. I'm sure there's some prettier patterns you can create, maybe using some stencils or something that looks a little bit more pretty and less like a third grader created this, but we're having fun and we're using up some of our supplies and we're trying new things. So that's really all that matters. Now this brown color is all separated and it kind of looks like the rotting poops, but you know what? Again, we're having fun, we'll blend, it's okay. I don't know if I'm having fun or I'm just getting a little bit high off the fumes of the nail polish at this point, but it's looking good, guys. It's looking good. And if you're really committed to finishing off what I feel is a hideous paper button, then feel free to let it dry and repeat the process on the back and then set your eyelets. I feel like the eyelets in this project is really the savior. Somehow it kind of ties the button together and makes it look not so plain, not so bad. It just elevates whatever you've done. It takes it up a notch. And I don't know, 3 cheers for the eyelets. If at this point you're feeling a little self-conscious about the way your buttons look, feel free to do what I did and just start painting some flat coats of a single color. It works, it's pretty, and actually I really like these because there really is no other painted button or anything else I did that remote like has that texture, that sheen look. I'm actually starting to, these are growing on me a little bit. Yeah, you can clearly see it and you're like, oh, this is nail polish. Like no other paint looks like it. It's awesome. I was just thinking too, if you have some like loose glitter, that might look really nice over a layer of like clear polish or that white polish. I think I may have to go back and try that. Remember, guys, your creativity is your only limitation. You remember those plain magazine images? I set some eyelets. I think it really elevated them, but I wanted to do something else a little bit more special, and I decided to use the eyelet to feed some string through to give this adorable dog a little bow. And so I actually used the eyelet, the inner portion of itself, to wrap the embroidery floss around and then put a little bit of glue to the back, but it's like a button with some dimension and texture. And you can use the eyelets to feed strings through or attach things, add dangles, charms, use your imagination. But yeah, I love how this turned out. This last fall, I made some leaf prints that I think are absolutely beautiful, and I think they would also make lovely buttons, really without having to do much else to them. I also did I think I called it like jelly print wrapping paper extravaganza, but I also did a bunch of jelly prints using wrapping paper, and the prints that I liked that worked really well I used, and the ones that didn't ended up in the jelly print throwaway stash. And there's still, different inks and textures and prints on them that I think would make a cool paper button, especially if I were to use it as a base for something else. So all I'm doing is just punching out some circles and other shapes to make into paper buttons, just like we've done throughout this entire video, and these come together very quickly. I hope this video inspired you to make some buttons out of materials you never would have considered making buttons out of. I think there were even a few things off camera that I made from additional magazines, music paper, book pages, gosh, cardstock. Oh my goodness. I ended up with so many buttons on my desk. I am going to have buttons for every project in the future. So, thank you so much for hanging out with me today. If you stuck it out till the end, thank you so much. You must love paper buttons almost as much as I do. But really, there is a button for any theme of journal. Really, you can incorporate them into just about anything you're making, working on. I hope you go out and make some paper buttons yourself. It's so satisfying. You can use so much of the supplies you have around you that maybe you've forgotten about. And again, they come together so quickly. I made this video in an afternoon and a half, and I have probably, I don't know, I feel like I could fill up a gallon size storage bag. And again, I have a button for just about any themed or color of journal I am working on. So, if you enjoyed this and you found value in this, please hit that like and subscribe button, and I can't wait to see you the next time.